Hi students, welcome to class. Today we're going to talk about urban and rural problems. Okay, so today we have two sets of think, pair, share questions. Let's go through the first 12. Explain why today we would say that we have global urbanization instead of just sporadic urbanization. What are megacities? What are some of the opportunities that come with the urbanization for poor nations, meaning positive? What are some of the negative consequences for poor nations under rapid urbanization? Explain urbanization from a functionalist perspective. Which theorist asserted that rapid social change would result in a state of anomie? Anomie is a term used in intro to sociology. It's a basic sociological term, so you need to know what that means. What is a state of anomie? What is the difference between mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity? And can you give an example? What's the difference between Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft? And can you give an example? In what way and to what extent are cities functional for society? In what way and to what extent are societies dysfunctional for society? Explain urbanization from a conflict perspective. And if you apply conflict theory to urbanization, what would you focus on and why? Our second set of think, pair, share questions, you are answering both of these, by the way. Explain urbanization from a symbolic interaction perspective. What would you focus on? According to Herbert Gons, what are the different types of urban dwellers? And then define the following terms: fiscal problems, crowding, substandard housing, homelessness, traffic and transportation, air pollution, public education, and crime. Who are homeless? Your homeless neighbors. Give a few categories. Explain some of the problems of rural life. Explain which problems of rural life are similar to problems of urban life, and explain which problems of real life are different from problems of urban life. Okay, let's talk about urbanization a little bit. Urbanization simply means the shift from a rural area to an urban area. So a community goes from being rural to being urban. Even Los Angeles was once a rural area. Orange County was literally filled with orange trees. It was a rural area where we largely grew the fruits like oranges and avocados. So we have had a pretty rapid shift within the last century in the United States from rural to urban. We've had large urbanized areas grow. We have several mega cities. LA is one of them. We have universities that had developed rapidly in the 19th century because of both immigration, industrialization, and urbanization as a consequence. And because of that, jobs are more plentiful. You tend to see higher incomes. A lot of the reasons why people live in and stay in urban areas is because there are more jobs and those jobs pay better. In addition to that, people have better access to healthcare and education. So there's more schools available, there's more higher education available, and there's more hospitals available. One of the issues, for example, in the Redwoods, is a lack of access to healthcare. So there are not that many hospitals, and they can't seem to find and keep medical professionals in that area. So a lot of people, as they're aging in that community, are struggling trying to find a doctor and keep a doctor. And women do tend to get better employment opportunities and better educational opportunities in urban areas as well. However, urbanization, especially urbanization in poorer communities, does come with some negative consequences. You do tend to see more children living on the street, so you see homeless children without parents, orphans. Many people who live in poor urban slums lack access to the necessities that they need. You see more urban slums, you see more overcrowding within communities. We're even starting to see that in wealthier nations like Los Angeles. You see overcrowding within apartments or homes, and we see more homelessness. You see a lot more pollution. So we tend to dump pollutants in areas that are poor or rural areas. So you see more pollution and you see more crime within, especially rapid urbanization or when you have overcrowding in urban slums. And then, of course, a lack of clean water and sanitation. And that happens in poor nation, especially when they're going through rapid urbanization, because they lack the critical infrastructure or the economics, essentially the money to pay for the critical infrastructure that's needed. So people are moving into those communities in a much faster rate than the government can actually fund the infrastructure and sanitation requirements for those communities. And we even see that in the United States from time to time. So what we have today is not just urbanization, but something we would call global urbanization. And that means that most of the world is becoming urbanized. And today we have, instead of sporadic cities developing or sporadically developed mega cities, we have global urbanization or mega cities throughout the world. So the book talks about in the 1800s, 3% of the world's population lived in urban areas, 3%. So most people lived in rural areas, most people could farm, and farming was actually the standard type of job that people had. People worked in their homes, they worked on their own personal farms, and that's how they made money. So that was the economics of that day. In the 1800s, we moved from predominantly farming to predominantly industrial jobs, which meant you worked in a factory or you were a coal miner. Today, we're predominantly service industry jobs, meaning you provide a service. You could be anything from a waitress to a teacher to a doctor. Those are all service jobs. And today, more than half of the world's population lives in urban areas. So most people live in urban areas, over 50%. That's quite a difference from 3% to 50%. The book says that by 2030, it's projected that 2/3, so 75%-ish of the world's population are projected to live in urban areas. And that most people will actually live in megacities. So LA is a good example of megacities. I gave you a few here. Mexico City is a megacity. Mexico City was a city before LA was anything, really. It was still rural. New York is a megacity. London's a megacity. Jamaica's a megacity. So I gave you a map here so you could see a few of them. But we have megacities all over the world. And the book projected that there would be 27 megacities by the end of 2025. I looked it up, and there's 28 megacities this year in 2022. So a megacity is simply a city with a population of over 10 million people. Compare that to the 1970s. When I was born, there were only 16 megacities. Okay, so let's talk about theoretical perspectives and how you would describe or explain urban cities, or the major assumptions that we have about cities from each of these perspectives. So going back to the core of sociology, you would learn about what functionalism is, conflict theory, and symbolic interaction theories. So you can use these theories to explain essentially any concept, because that's what theories are meant to do. They're meant to help you establish the research exploration, and then also to analyze once you have data collected. So from a functionalist perspective, cities have a variety of important functions for society as a whole. We're always looking at the functions of, or if it is functional or not, when we're looking at a functional perspective. So from a functionalist perspective, cities are both functional and dysfunctional. They would look at the relative merits and disadvantages of urban life versus rural life. So what we were talking about previously, how urban life is functional for communities, families, societies as a whole, and how it's dysfunctional for communities, families, and societies. So lack of access to healthcare or more access to healthcare is how cities can be both functional and dysfunctional for society. And then you would look at it in terms of the particular degree to which it's functional or dysfunctional for society, for that community, for things like social bonding that exist within communities. So social bonding is an important aspect of urban areas and communities, because you do tend to see what we call social capital within communities. That means the connection between residents within the communities and how that offers you access to resources in a variety of ways. So from a conflict perspective, you're looking at it from the perspective of haves and have-nots, right? So cities are run by political elites, economic elites, those who have all of the wealth, make all the decisions, and they make the decisions to benefit themselves and not necessarily to benefit the masses, not to benefit your family or working class families, but to enrich their own lives. And often those interests are in conflict with each other, right? So what benefits the elites often is to the disadvantage of the working people. And that because people come from a diversity of social backgrounds, it often contributes to the conflict over the norms and values within communities and within cities. If you're looking at it from a symbolic interaction perspective, which is the only micro level perspective here, so both functionalism and conflict theories are both macro level, so you want to keep it on a macro level, meaning that they're going to do the analysis on a large group basis. You're looking at societies, communities, statistical groups, that type of thing. From a symbolic interactionist perspective, it's a micro level perspective. So you're looking at the interaction between individual people on a micro level, right? And what types of interactions and perceptions those people have, and how that contributes to the overall health of a city. So from a symbolic interactionist perspective, cities aren't necessarily dangerous, chaotic places. Rather, they're a location where you have your own set of norms and values and culture that exist within that community or within that city. And that develops amongst individual people and carries over throughout time. So it is then taught, socialized to younger people, to people who immigrate into the city, and that it takes on a life of its own and becomes its own identity. So we kind of know that inherently, right? Cities have their own identity, and oftentimes we'll move to a city because we like the identity of that city. Okay, so let's talk just a moment about structural functional theories and anomie. So when we talk about functionalism, again, macro level theory, so we want to talk about it in terms of macro level perspective. societies, communities, and groups. Now, Durkheim, our structural functionalist, our father of functionalism, you could say, right, said essentially that rapid urbanization or rapid social change in general results in a state of anomie. So this is one of your basic sociology terms that you would know from Intro to Soc. And anomie is a sense of normlessness. What that means is you have a loss of sense of internal value or understanding. He related it first to a sense of, when you work for yourself and you build something for yourself, there's value inherent in that labor and you own the results of your labor. But if you work for someone else for wages, it develops a sense of normlessness or a sense of anomie, where you lose that internal value that you get from that job or from that labor, and you don't own what you create in the end. Think about the difference between how you would cook a meal for yourself, your friends, and your family versus how you would cook a meal if you worked at McDonald's for everybody going through the drive-through, right? There's that lack of value and attachment and inherent connection to the food that you're serving to people. So that sense is what he means by a sense of anomie, or another way to say is normlessness, right? And because of that rapid social change, that rapid urbanization is going to create that, and it results in a sense of deregulation. And so people become unregulated in their behavior and unregulated in their interactions with others. The norms and the values and the mores of communities break down. A good example of the way that you would think about this is think about it in communities that are rapidly urbanized and become urban slums. So in poor rural communities, you don't tend to see a lot of person-on-person crime like assault and theft from people on the streets. But in urban slums and big mega cities that are extremely poor, you do tend to see a lot of that type of crime. So mugging and that type of thing. That is what they mean by breaking down of values and mores and norms. Because people lack solidarity in those mega cities like they have in smaller communities, they lack that collective consciousness, and so there's not really much holding those norms and values and mores together within that community. A few of the definitions that you need to know about collective consciousness or types of solidarity. So we've got two main types of solidarity: mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. Now, from a functionalist perspective, mechanical solidarity is the stronger of the two of the collective consciousness because people have shared jobs. Whereas organic solidarity is the weaker of the collective consciousness, meaning that people rely on each other but don't necessarily share jobs. So from a functionalist perspective, if you have the same job as someone else, have you ever, been at work and you go on to break and you both share in kind of complaining about your particular job, maybe the customers or the intricacies of the job, and you can share that complaint and that stress together because you understand what the other person is going through because you're doing the job together. So that is mechanical solidarity. Organic solidarity would be more that you rely on someone else, like within your family members, you rely on spouses or parents to do their share to keep the family going, to keep the roof over your head, to take care of the family as a whole. But think about that in a city. So we rely on each other to keep everything going, but we don't have a very strong collective consciousness. We don't understand from the other person's perspective. So you might rely on people who cook for you, clean the toilets behind you, pick up your trash on trash day, but you don't have necessarily a sense of shared community with them, because even though you rely on them, that sense of solidarity is lacking because you don't understand from their perspective. And so what happens is in Gesellschaft communities, meaning bigger communities, usually urban communities, megacities for sure, you have weak and impersonal organic solidarity, meaning you rely on each other to keep that city, megacity, or community together, but you don't necessarily feel connected because you don't have those interpersonal relationships. Excuse me. So you have a sense of weaker collective consciousness. Now, in a Gemeinschaft community, you tend to have more mechanical solidarity. And in those societies, you're more connected to family, kin. Kin is family that you're connected to, like your cousins and your aunts and your uncles, extended family. That's what kin is. By the way, women tend to be kin keepers. They're the ones that tend to maintain the relationships between kin or the extended family or family in general. So when societies lose women, like when you have mostly men in a society and you've killed off all the baby girls, or if you've destroyed all of the power of women in society and removed all of their power and only men get to make decisions for the economics and the family, you tend to lose that strong kinship. So it breaks down those kin societies. But in a Gemeinschaft community, you tend to have very strong family kin relationships. You have strong community ties, so people know each other. They tend to have a strong collective consciousness because people are looking out for each other, and because people tend to have similar types of jobs. So in a farming community, people do the same type of work and they know each other. They know your business. A Gemeinschaft community, maybe your kids are out up to no good and they're causing problems over at the local pharmacy or the local, small town, like neighborhood store, right? And so they're doing something they shouldn't. By the time that those kids get home, their parents already know what's going on because somebody in the community has already called mom or dad to tell mom or dad what the kids are up to. That's a Gemeinschaft community. Everybody's in everybody's business and everyone knows you. So from a conflict theorist perspective, again, we're talking about macro level, society level. So a conflict perspective theorist is going to look at a city, a globalized urban area, and they're going to talk about how the bourgeoisie, who are the elites, who are the haves, right, maintain power, control, how they are working in their own best interest, and how the working class, the proletariat, their interests are antagonistic towards the elite, and the elite's interests are antagonistic towards the proletariats. So from a conflict perspective, there's always that antagonism because the two interests of those groups do not combine. What's good for the bourgeoisie is not good for the proletariat, working class communities, or working communities, and what's good for the working communities is not necessarily good for those who own all of the wealth. So the conflict theorist is going to focus on and assert that all of the interactions, whether they're political or economic within those institutions, and all of the ideologies, they're going to be set by the elites in the society. So the ideologies that we hear are the ideologies of the elite. The decisions that are made for cities on where to build and what communities to destroy to make a new freeway or to build a new urban area or urban center, those are based on the interest of the elites. They're not based on the interest of the people who live in the community or the people who work in the community. So generally what you're going to have is a collaboration between bankers and real estate investors and politicians and other elites, and they're going to make those decisions. So they're not going to have any real issue with gentrifying a community or destroying a community if it works in their best fiscal interest. So urban development takes place along those lines, displacing poor people, displacing urban poor residents in order to grow economic well-being for the elites has been the status quo and will continue to be the standard moving forward in all urban communities and in rural communities often as well. Okay, so from a symbolic interaction perspective, this is our micro level perspective. This is the one that's going to focus on the nature of the urban residents' interactions with each other. So how people interact with each other and how that creates the norms, the values, and the mores of that city, of that community. It's the pattern of the interaction. So why does that happen and how does that happen? How is that then socialized and how does that gain a life of its own? And so they're going to look at more of that micro level perceptions or perspectives in various aspects of urban life and the positive and negative consequences of those. And they can see how, from that symbolic interactionist perspective, cities can be places where you're going to highlight, or those particular cities would highlight particular norms or values. A good example of that is, I would say, in Orange County and in LA County, we don't use plastic bags, right? So when you go to the grocery store, they don't just give you plastic bags. You do have to buy them if you want one, right? Or you bring your own bag. And that kind of highlights that idea of a little bit more environmental consciousness and protection of the environment and attempting to not waste or not create additional trash, plastic, and waste that we don't necessarily need to do. Whereas if you go to, say, for example, Texas, Houston, not only, do you get plastic bags with everything, but even if you ask them not to give you a plastic bag, they will often give you a plastic bag anyways. I remember a recent trip of mine, I said, "Oh, I don't need a bag, thank you." And the guy got visibly irritated with me for declining a plastic bag, put the stuff in plastic bag anyways, and then kind of threw it at me, right? So what that does is that kind of highlights the intentions. Like, one is a stance for the environment, the other one is a political stance for, that idea that it's your right or the individual's right to use up society or the world's resources, right? And that it's for you to use at your disposal. So those will kind of highlight the different norms and values of the society. And it also, from that perspective, will shed new light on the idea that cities are chaotic or unruly or full of criminals. I've heard people say, I remember I was in Northern California and I was talking to a guy who we were stuck in traffic and because they were doing road work. And he's like, oh, where are you guys from? He asked me, and he's like, oh yeah, in LA, there's so much crime. People just get shot on the streets. And if you work on the streets, if you're doing rebuilding of the streets there, those workers, they can even get shot. And I was completely stunned because I was thinking, that's what my husband does. My son works in that industry, and I've always felt safe. I never feel like my husband or my son is going to get, shot just because he's at work. I actually feel like it's more dangerous for me working in a school because I've been through a, active shooter situation. But I just thought it was interesting that he had that perception that everybody's just getting shot everywhere they go and there's no sense of safety, that it's wild, that it's chaotic, right? That's very crime-ridden, and dangerous. And so what we know is that there's not just one type of urban dweller. So this guy, Herman Gons, he identified that there's several types of urban dwellers. Now, there are people there that are trapped in urban areas that want to leave the urban area but feel like they can't do so for either they're fiscally, economically trapped there, or trapped through a lack of access to other opportunities or through kin ties. So there are people that are trapped. There are people who are deprived in urban areas that have low education and lower salaries. But there's also a lot of people in urban areas who are highly educated, highly skilled, and want to live in their urban community for a variety of reasons. Many people live in their urban communities. I think that was the street sweeper. I hope I'm not going to get a ticket. They live in their urban communities because of the cultural attractions. Many of us live in cities or communities because we like the culture of that particular city, or we'll move there for that reason. A lot of people will live there and then once they have families, especially in the United States, will decide to migrate to more suburban areas. But you also have a lot of people who immigrate from other countries, and they move into cities because they want to be close to other people from their same, home location. And so you have immigrants from a variety of different ethnic groups who will live in a community where they have other people who speak their language and they can get the food that they want, right? And they can create those social bonds and they can feel comfortable within their community. So we have a variety of different types of urban dwellers. In LA and Orange County, we do tend to have benefit from that, right? Ethnic villagers. So unlike many rural areas or other urban areas, we really benefit from the fact that we have ethnic villagers in different pockets around our communities. You can go and get authentic Thai food, authentic Japanese food, authentic Mexican food, authentic African food, right? Anywhere anything you want, and you can get that type of food in your community and without too much of a drive. So we benefit in a variety of ways, but that's just probably my favorite way, I guess. Okay, I had to check. It wasn't the street sweeper, it was actually they're painting the middle of the road. So I was a little bit worried and I was having a hard time concentrating. But let's talk about problems of urban life. So we're going to talk about fiscal problems, crowding, substandard housing, homelessness, traffic and transportation, air pollution, public education, and crime. So cities typically have some some difficulties paying for basic services such as policing, public education, trash removal, maintenance. All of those are the responsibility of cities, and that cost can be rather high because the number of people within the community are rather high. So depending on the wealth of the community, you can see quite a bit of variation in terms of how well the community's policed, how good the public education is, how good they are at building up their infrastructure and then maintaining that infrastructure. You can see often overcrowding. You can have a large number of people living in a small amount of space. We are today seeing trends towards tiny homes, people living in their vehicles, people living multiple generations in one household. All of those are issues of what we would call overcrowding, because the cost of living and housing has skyrocketed, but our wages have not, essentially have not really increased since the 1970s. So you just have a huge population density, and you can have household crowding and a number of, large numbers of people within a city. Oftentimes you have substandard housing. So anytime you have housing, I think many of us in California have experienced this, where basically you rent an apartment at the highest cost that they can get, or price that they can get for that apartment. So you're paying, a standard rate, $2,000 a month. But essentially you have a slumlord, right? They're not going to break anything. You have heating, you may not have air conditioning. You probably have lead paint, you might have an infestation of cockroaches. And all of this is at an unaffordable cost for most people. Again, why we're seeing a trend towards people living in their vehicles or living in RVs or trying to build tiny homes, just a way to get out of that trap of renting substandard housing. I own now, but I rented for most of my life, well into my 30s. And I've never lived in a single dwelling home. Actually, I've only ever lived in apartments, and even my house today is a townhouse. And I was talking to a colleague of mine, and we were talking about landlords. And I was telling her, because she's telling me about her landlord is a slumlord, but doesn't charge her a lot. And I was like, come to think of it, I never had a landlord that fixed things. I had only ever had slumlords. So you learn to never ask for anything to get fixed in your apartment for fear of them raising your rent again to a higher rate. Because of this high cost of living, we see ever increasing homelessness in our communities. And it's really hard to determine the actual rate of homelessness. Again, there's people living in their vehicles that don't want to be. There's people living in RVs that don't want to be. There's people living on the streets. There's people couch surfing, living with friends or family and moving from place to place. And that especially becomes really difficult to calculate and know how many people live like that. There are hardly any shelters in most urban areas. We very much underfund any kind of social services for the homeless, mostly because we individual blame people for becoming homeless. And most people who move from having shelter to being homeless, 75% of the people who become homeless have a job before they become homeless. That rate significantly drops after they become homeless, but most people who become homeless have a job when they become homeless. 75%, so 3/4 of those people. once you do become homeless, you are 3 times more likely to become a victim of violence or theft. So especially when you live on the street or you live in a vehicle, you're open to theft and open to violence from everybody who's around, including other homeless people, but also from just the public in general. They do feel like homeless people are an easy target or a deserving target for violence or theft. You do tend to see a lot of traffic and transportation issues in large urban areas. You see that public education can often lack funding, or and so the opportunity for a good public education for those who are poor or working class can be hard to access. And then you do tend to see more crime in big cities, than you do in rural areas. So who are our homeless neighbors? When we talk about who's homeless, in the 1980s, Reagan defunded mental health institutions. And so a lot of people who lived in hospitals or who needed chronic, like long-term care, they lost their care and became homeless. And so today we still see high rates of people who are homeless that have mental illnesses. The book says 26% of people who are homeless have a mental illness. 16% of people who are physically disabled are homeless. What that really shows is that we lack a kind of standard of care for those with disabilities or mental health issues. And so instead of those people being able to access resources to maintain stability in their life, they essentially become homeless because they have the mental illness or the physical disability and they can't financially support themselves. About 15% of people who are homeless are employed. In LA, I looked up the rates in LA, it's about 19%. So in Los Angeles, almost 20% of the people who are homeless have a job, but about 75% of those people had a job prior to becoming homeless. So it's the chaotic, unstructured nature of homelessness that leads to people losing a job often, as opposed to losing a job and then becoming homeless, which does happen. But once that happens, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to find another job. There's some real serious barriers to finding a job while you're homeless. Besides having a physical address to put on an application, having lack of access to a toilet, to a shower, to a structured environment where you can meet your basic needs, that creates a situation where it becomes sometimes almost impossible to find or hold down a job. And then a lot of the people who are homeless are women and children. So most of the time when women and children are in a severe situation of domestic violence, they're the ones that have to leave. And so we see about 13% of victims of domestic violence end up homeless. And that's because the person who is the aggressor is going to keep the home. And the person who is the victim is generally the one that's going to end up having to leave. And then as well, touching back on mental illness and physical disabilities, military veterans who should have access to resources also lack access to resources. And for a variety of reasons, we do see about 13% of homeless individuals tend to be military veterans. So what are some of the problems that we see with rural life as opposed to urban life? So today, about 40% of our population lives in a rural area. So think, less dense population, more farmlands, more open spaces, and less crowding. You do tend to see property crime and violent crime tends to be lower in these areas. The air does tend to be cleaner. There tends to be less traffic and fewer factories because of the type of jobs that people do. And you do tend to see lower levels of stress and anxiety. That has a lot to do with the lower levels of noise, the lower levels of pollution, and the lower expectation or the lower cost of living. So people aren't as stressed in trying to maintain or meet just their basic needs. You do tend to see higher levels of poverty and drug use. Now you see what happens with communities that lack access to the economy, so people can't find jobs. As we see higher levels of joblessness, especially among people who want to find a job, you see also a correlation, an increase in drug use. So if people want work and they can't find work, they're more likely to become drug addicts, use drugs and become drug addicts. So with an increase in poverty due to lack of work, you see an increase in drug use. So those same lack of services and employment opportunities are connected to drug use. And you also see a lack of things like healthcare, medical clinics, pharmacies, those type of things. And then you see a lack of, teachers, nurses, doctors. School enrollment might be lower, so they're not going to fund the school as well. And you're not going to be able to recruit and retain the skilled individuals for those types of jobs. We also do tend to see more domestic violence as a feature in rural areas. So in rural areas, you're more likely to be in a situation of domestic violence. One is that the men within the communities may not be achieving the power and prestige that they believe that they deserve. And so that can lead to an increase in domestic violence in the home. You also see that police officers are just not as aware or as interested in dealing with domestic violence appropriately. So what are some of the things that you would be able to do to help just to help to service your community, whatever type of community you live in? You can volunteer in all types of social services agencies in your community, things like Habitat for Humanity. You can attend city council meetings, so you can become more knowledgeable about your community. You can vote. I do recommend voting. And I also recommend that when you vote, you want to not just read that little tidbit in the front, which often is misleading. You also want to read the full description in the back of the book. So it's always going to give you that full description. And I know people don't like to do a lot of reading because they get bored with it. But it is really important because you don't want to vote against your own interests. I know, like, for example, with the no plastic thing in Orange County, a lot of people were really mad that they had to pay. They have to pay now for, they have to pay for a plastic bag if they want it. And so they were really upset about that. But we voted on it. And that little tidbit in the front, it was like, it said, no pay plastic or, pay plastic. And so a lot of people pick the no pay plastic, but if you went to the back and you read it, it's the no pay plastic meant that the businesses didn't have to pay, and the pay plastic meant that the businesses had to pay or donate. They had to donate to a nonprofit organization or environmental cause if they were putting out plastic. And so people chose wrong. They just they picked wrong. They picked in the interest of the industry instead of in their own interest, and then they were mad about it. So read that little note in the back of your voting thing. And that's it for today. Have a wonderful day.